Hello and welcome to the first video in a series of videos that I will be creating on how to compose music in a cinematic style using free software. Today I will be showing how to use Cakewalk, which is a free DAW or digital audio workstation for Windows. For software instruments, I will be using two plugins by Spitfire Audio. First, the BBCSO Discover series, which you can get for free if you fill out a survey on their website. Second, Spitfire's Labs, which is a collection of instruments that they've been putting out every month. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how to get the most out of these sample libraries and to compose a short piece from start to finish, including developing a simple idea, orchestrating that idea, and getting a basic mix, all using free software. While I'll be demonstrating with Cakewalk, any DAW will do. Okay, let's get started. The first thing I've done is to create my own template for the BBCSO Discover library. I like to put each articulation on its own track. Here you see the piccolo longs and shorts separated. I'll go ahead and click the plugin interface, and you can see that I've selected the appropriate articulation. You could do this with key switches, but I think it's easier for me personally to have them separated. I've done this for each instrument, and I've organized them by section: woodwind, brass, strings, percussion. I've also color-coded the sections to make orchestrating and mixing much easier. Notice how the interface shows each instrument in concert stage formation. Because each instrument was recorded in the correct position on a concert stage, I don't have to worry about panning my tracks or applying EQ to simulate distance. I've also added a few of the Labs instruments, ones that I thought would fit my composition. The Labs instruments are mostly non-orchestral instruments recorded with close mics or even synthesizers, pads, and effects patches. Let's take a look at the soft piano. Here on the left we have expression, which is the overall volume, and here we have dynamics, which crossfades between dynamic layers. I can control dynamics with my modulation wheel, or MIDI CC number 1. Here we have the effects panel. For the soft piano, our only option is to add reverb. I tend to use a piano patch to generate material, so I'll start improvising with the Labs soft piano and hopefully come up with a melody. Okay, so off camera I just spent some time developing a short melody with simple chords. To keep things relatively simple, I chose to write in A-flat major, and for the most part, I stick to the notes of the A-flat major scale in both harmony and melody. For this particular piece, I wanted to emphasize the 7th scale degree, because to my ear, there's an inherent sentimental or even nostalgic quality to the sound of the major 7th in certain musical contexts. I wanted to capture that quality here. I'll now play the melody in the right hand of the piano and accompany with block chords in the left hand. So let's call that the A section of my piece. I begin in the tonic of A-flat major with a basic idea that outlines the major third, A-flat to C, as well as G, the 7th scale degree, and by rhythmically emphasizing the ascending half step from the leading tone back to tonic, I'm attempting to capture that sense of longing or nostalgia. So that basic idea is repeated exactly, and then repeated again, although this time I shift to the 4 chord, or D-flat major. The A-flat to C in the right hand stays the same, but now the C is the 7th scale degree of D-flat major. The overall pitch collection remains the same, and if I were to play a scale over the D-flat chord, I'd actually be playing a Lydian scale, with the raised 4th scale degree. While the second phrase begins with a similar melodic structure, the contour changes when I go up to the high F, or the third scale degree of D flat. I then chromatically raise the D flat to D natural, and then treat this D natural as the third scale degree of a B flat 7 chord. In classical harmony, this would be labeled as a 5-6-5 of 5 that resolves to a cadential 6-4 chord. Music theory terminology aside, I'm essentially moving up by half step in the lowest voice until I get to the E flat, which will bring us back to the tonic of A flat. When I figure out the harmonies, I'm really not thinking about Western classical music theory. I'm simply using my ear to form chords around a bass line and melody line. Okay, to recap the A section, I introduce a basic idea, then repeat it. We'll call that the presentation phrase. I then alter that idea with new harmony and melody. We'll call this the continuation phrase. Let's now look at the B section of my piece. Here I return to A flat major, and instead of emphasizing the 7th scale degree, I'll emphasize the 4th scale degree, or D flat. You'll often see the 4th scale degree in the context of a 4-3 suspension, where the 4 will resolve down by step to 3. However, here I chose to include both the 3rd and 4th scale degrees simultaneously. That sounds like this. It's a sonority that I use in many genres, including contemporary classical, jazz, or cinematic. To me, it sounds stable, as a tonic chord should, but it offers a bit more color and variety. Okay, let's look at the B section melody. Remember, before, the A section melody began with that ascending major 3rd. The B section begins with an ascending major 4th, emphasizing the D flat that I mentioned. I'll play the full B section melody now. So now I'll move the left hand to a first inversion A flat chord with a C in the bass. This chord wants to resolve to the 4 chord with an added 6th, that B flat. Now I cadence back to the A flat, and we're home in the tonic key. So, putting both sections together, the melody and harmony of my piece sound like this. Okay, so now I'm recording a piano version of my short piece into the soft piano MIDI track. I'll use this as the template from which I can then orchestrate. I've made a few significant changes to the music, and I think they give the piece more emotion and character. The right hand of the piano hasn't changed, but I've improved the left hand quite substantially. Instead of block chords, I've written an arpeggiated 8th note figure to give the piece forward momentum. I've added some counterpoint in the left hand to make it more interesting, and expanded the range of the left hand because I'm thinking about a full orchestral texture here, one that has a much broader range from top to bottom. Notice that I've determined the tempo to be around 132 beats per minute, and I've kept the time signature at 4/4 for now. I'll have to go in and adjust the meters to fit with what I'm playing. I actually adjusted Cakewalk's click track to de-emphasize beat 1. That way I'm not very aware of the 4/4 pattern, and I can play in whatever meter comes to me. So now I'll just go into the piano roll view to clean things up. I'm moving everything over one measure to measure 1, and I'm going to quantize the start of every note. There are plenty of instances where I wouldn't want to quantize everything because the imperfections usually make the music more human, but in this case I'm okay with it. Cakewalk also allows you to set the strength of the quantization if you like. Okay, let's give this a listen now. So now I'll just go in and fix a few issues that I heard. I was mostly improvising this in, and I often make decisions on the fly that I don't always love afterwards. But it's nothing that I can't edit in the piano roll, so that's what I'm doing now. Here I just had to add an eighth note in the left hand that I somehow forgot to play. I'm also going to remove the last few notes here in the left hand. I think it'll be a more convincing ending. So I'm just going to edit the duration of these last notes to match, and looking at the sustain pedal MIDI data here. This is CC64. I will say one negative thing about Cakewalk, in my opinion, is the MIDI automation and just drawing in MIDI lines and curves is a little bit finicky. So I'm fairly happy with how that turned out. Now I need to go back and determine the time signatures throughout. And the way I do that is I turn on the click track and listen measure by measure and determine if there's a change at any point. This, of course, isn't absolutely necessary. You could keep it all in 4/4. I just prefer to have things line up very neatly. I'm going to go ahead and do this for the entire piece, and after that, we'll start orchestrating. So I finished making the necessary meter changes, and off camera I've orchestrated the A section of my piece. It's very important that I spend some time thinking about the overall structure of textures over the course of the piece before I start orchestrating. I like to consider how the density of my orchestration might evolve over time, and for this piece, I wanted to start out very thin with the solo piano as is, and then slowly introduce instruments, gradually building in density. I'll hold off on the full orchestral timbre until the B section. I'll break down my orchestration choices track by track, starting with the Labs instruments. As I said in the beginning of the video, these are just a few of the Labs instruments out of many that I chose for this particular piece. Here we have a few pad synth textures that serve to complement the piano harmony by adding some warmth and color. Here's a glass piano pad. It's very subtle, meant to hide in the background almost unnoticed. I also have a synth pad here, which has a shorter attack to give some articulation. But again, very subtle, not to distract from the soft piano foreground material. Let's hear what those sound like in context. I'll probably need to increase the volume on these pads just a bit, but they're simply there to add some warmth. So you probably had a difficult time even noticing them, and like I said, I haven't mixed this yet, so I'll probably balance this section later. but these two tracks are simply meant to be background color. Okay, moving on to the marimba track. I chose to slowly introduce the marimba here because it's a wooden color that I thought would blend well with the piano. I could potentially choose from any of these percussion mallet instruments shown here, but most of the others have a metallic sound, meaning much brighter than the marimba. I'll save them for the B section. The marimba part adds to the eighth note pulse of the left hand of the piano, so it's adding motion to the piece and pointing us forward. I imagine the marimba player would use 4 mallets here, with the 2 of the right hand playing the simple eighth note pattern, and the 2 in the left hand playing in the lower octave, outlining the harmonic motion. Notice all of these velocities that were recorded in when I played the piece, and there was quite a bit of variation that makes the part more lifelike. Okay, let's hear how this sounds in the context. Okay, let's see what else I've added. Notice there's not a lot going on. It's pretty thin, like I said. Here I have the violas doubling the clarinets with a slow, sustained texture. These are 2 instruments that have a lot of warmth in their lower range, and they blend nicely together. They'll also blend nicely with the piano and marimba. So the violas and clarinets are sustaining, and I use the modulation wheel and volume automation to slowly fade them in to minimize the abrupt attack. Let's hear what this sounds like in context. So to make the clarinet part a little more realistic, I have this A-flat note split up to allow the player to breathe. I chose to do the same in the violas, although I wouldn't have to. This is simply a choice I made because I thought that one long held note sounded a bit synthy over time. However, I don't love the attack and release sounds of these samples, so they may need to be adjusted slightly. I often find myself spending way too much time adjusting the placement of MIDI notes, but for the sake of time, I won't bother editing much. Notice the slight swells in the CC1 or modulation wheel data, just again to make it more realistic. So the last thing that I added in the A section was this bassoon and cello sustaining texture. It's similar to the viola and clarinet part, but it's pitched a fifth below them, and it outlines that D flat to D natural to the E flat line in the left hand of the piano. So here we have the clarinet and viola entering, and then the bassoon and cello. Again, just slowly introducing instruments, and then we're ready for the B section. So the first thing that I orchestrated in the B section was the foreground melody. Let's take a look at the woodwinds. The melody is in the upper octave of the flutes and the oboes. Notice the modulation wheel data in both tracks. Again, this is to shape the lines and to provide a little bit more realism in the phrasing. Okay, let me add in the clarinets now, and I chose to position them in their middle to lower range. It's a little bit more interesting than just a one long held note. But its main function here is just to support the harmony with inner voices. And lastly, in the woodwinds, I'll add in the bassoons. So they're filling out the bottom end of the woodwind range with the tonic in the fifth. So all in all, this is a very simple woodwind voicing. And when I say voicing, all I mean is how I'm organizing the notes, both in terms of register and in terms of how they fit in the chord with respect to the other instruments. Okay, so you notice that I chose not to use brass here, and that's because I think the sound of the brass library is way too big for this piece. Here's what the horn sounds like, for instance. Sometimes I think our instincts are to use every instrument all the time, but one of the tricks of a good orchestrator is to know when not to use something, or in this case, an entire section of instruments. Moving on to the strings now. In the first half of the B section, I have the strings in a sustaining pad texture, one that takes up the full range of the section. So I have the violin ones in the highest range of the strings here, and I actually split them up into 3 parts. So here are the violin ones. And second violins. So they are voiced below the first violins, I think divided into 2 notes. So the violas below them, the A flat and the D flat, so that added 4th. Below them, the celli, which playing what the bassoons were playing, the A flat and the E flat. Same range as the bassoons. And finally, the low octave A flat in the basses, rounding out the full range of the string section. I also have some cello and bass pits, just to add some motion into the string parts. I think these pizzicatos help to punctuate the meter and just to give a sense of motion. Okay, so now we're in the second half of the B section. The violin ones have dropped down in register like the oboes did, and there's just some very simple voice leading. Something to keep in mind when writing a melodic line in the strings is that the BBCSO Discover library does not have any legato patches. There's no fancy legato transition when you overlap notes, so you have to be careful with how you handle this. The slower the line, the better, and like I mentioned before, you have to deal with the scooping sound of the attack. I didn't spend too much time on this myself, but if it were more exposed, I probably would need to. To do this effectively, you'd probably want to look at the CC1 data and maybe even the volume automation. So you still hear that scooping attack sound, but it's not going to be as exposed, so I'm not going to worry about it for now. And again, this is the kind of thing that I could spend hours on, in each track of the piece, just trying to polish and make the best possible rendition. Okay, so let's add in the woodwinds and see what that sounds like, strings and woodwinds together. So nothing all that unusual or exciting about the orchestration. It's all very traditional in approach. Just to sum up what I did, I organized the pitch material first by section, so woodwinds and then strings. I then organized the material by function, so the upper woodwinds carry the melody and the lower winds have harmonic support. Finally, I organized by register, where flutes and oboes are in the upper octave, clarinets in the middle, and bassoons in the lower octave. The same is true for the strings from top to bottom. None of the instruments are overlapping or voice crossing. Okay, so moving on to the percussion section. And here is where I hope to make the orchestration more interesting. And I do that by adding motion and middle ground material. So if you recall, I already began to introduce the eighth note motion in the marimba from the A section. So I'm just going to continue that. And I'm going to base that on some of the left hand of the piano that I originally played in. So in addition, I'm going to keep the left hand of the piano and also have these two mandolin patches here that will complement that eighth note pattern. Okay, so let's look up here at the harp track. So I have kind of a two-handed harp texture here with the left hand playing those eighth notes and the right hand, or the upper register hand, playing basically the melody with some added rolled chords. So in the bottom half of the harp part, I copied and pasted in the left hand of the piano. And here we have that counter melody, if you will. Up here in the right hand, I tried to make the melody a little bit more idiomatic for the harp. And so I have a rolled first chord followed by the melody in octaves. So idiomatic here just means that I am trying to write a part that's specifically designed for the harp, and one that, effectively uses what the harp is good at. And in this case, it's these rolled chords and then octaves. So I've added in the celeste and now the orchestral percussion patch, which includes several different sounds. So I think I'm just going to stick with the triangle. Let's hear how that sounds. So the celeste has that upper melody, again with the rolled chords like the harp, and the triangle just has a downbeat. Okay, moving on to the tubular bells. And again, just sort of complementing the melody. Notice the tubular bells part that I have isn't an exact copy, note for note, of the other mallet instruments. I think one of the tricks to writing good mallet percussion parts is to avoid copying a line exactly, so instead complement or imply the same idea simply by adding or subtracting a few notes here or there. Okay, so let me add in the glockenspiel now. So it's complementing that melody with subtle differences. All of these mallet instruments, these metallic mallet instruments, are sort of combining to do the same thing. In each case, they're slightly different, so it makes it a little bit more interesting overall. And now the marimba. Again, just continuing that eighth note pattern that I established before. Filling out the lower range of the mallet instruments. Let's add in that piano. You see here, I lowered the volume just a little bit to blend in the background. In the second half of this B section, I remove a lot of that high metallic sound just to stay out of the way of the woodwinds and strings who have moved down into a lower octave. Okay, so I want to add some of these synth pads back in. Just background harmonic support. You can definitely hear that added fourth or the D flat in this synth patch. I also have this hand bells patch from the Labs series. And just keep in mind that this is close mic'd, so in order to blend with the orchestra, I'll probably need to lower the volume and add some reverb later. This is just another metal percussion instrument that will fit in nicely with, the tubular bells, for instance. Okay, so lastly, I have these two mandolin patches. Again, these are close mic'd, and they don't necessarily fit in a traditional orchestra texture, but I liked how they sounded. This first patch is a fingered mandolin, and this is a picked mandolin. Again, these are close mic'd, so I will want to add reverb to blend them. And you'll also notice that the mandolin 1 patch here with the eighth notes, it's not an exact copy from the eighth notes of the piano or the marimba, so there's some, it fits in, it doesn't conflict at all, but it is its own part. Okay, so let's add everybody in and see what the whole thing sounds like. So keep in mind I haven't mixed anything or balanced any of the volumes, but here's what it sounds like. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how that's turned out so far, and the last stage of this process would be to mix and master. I'll keep this part very short and simple. I'm going to do a quick balance between the tracks, and then apply some reverb where necessary and some basic EQ on the master bus. So now on to mixing. The first thing that I do is to make sure that the master fader is at a level somewhere between about -10 dB and -20 dB. I'll look specifically at the loudest part of my piece. In this case, that would be the beginning of the B section. If your peak level is much greater than about -10, you should consider lowering the track faders evenly. It looks like I'm in a good range here, and I did that by lowering each track to -6 dB before I did any other balancing. From that -6 dB starting point, I either raised or lowered each track volume to get a basic mix. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, I used some volume automation throughout to adjust specific moments in this piece. This simulates how real-life performers would instinctively get louder or softer to fit in the texture, depending on their role within that texture. The process of balancing the overall levels of the faders and the subsequent volume automation process would normally take me several hours. Right now I'm hurrying through this process, but it is a crucial part of mixing. So the next thing that I want to do is to mix these 3 Labs instruments over here, the ones that are close mic'd. The goal is to try to get them in the same virtual space or virtual stage as the orchestral instruments. And the easiest way to do this would be to add reverb. I could go ahead and add an insert for each of these tracks, but instead I will create a stereo bus track and then send a copy of each of these 3 tracks to that stereo bus, which will contain the reverb unit. So I'm going to choose a reverb on this stereo bus, and I will choose this thing called Reverb 2 by Cakewalk. Because the BBCSO Discover is recorded in a concert hall, I will choose the hall setting here and then find a preset. This will just be a starting place where I can then adjust the details. I'll choose the warm orchestra here, and I might want to adjust the tail time or the size of the room. I definitely need to lower the dry signal to 0. Because remember, I'm just sending a copy. That original signal will still be coming from these tracks down here. So all I want from this reverb plugin is the processed sound. Okay, so I also have to now actually send these tracks. So I do that by going to sends and finding this bus that I created. Now the levels of this signal will default to 0 dB, or basically the exact same level as the track itself. We are on a post fader, so keep that. I will definitely want to lower this send, but it's always good to just listen and then make adjustments. So here's what it sounds like without the reverb. And now with the reverb. So that's way too much. First, I'll adjust the settings directly on this plugin. Just make the room smaller and the tail size a little shorter. Now I need to adjust the send level. I'm going to bring that down quite a bit, maybe to about -10. I won't know exactly what I need until I listen to the full mix. Let's go ahead and bring in the other instruments, these 2 mandolin patches. So you can tell that they sound a little bit further back now. And let's add everybody in to see how it sounds. So that sounded okay. You can definitely hear them, but they're further back in the mix now. The last thought that I had would be to pan these 2 mandolin tracks, one to the left and one to the right, just so that they're not directly in the center of the mix. And remember, because these BBCSO Discover instruments were recorded on stage in their position, I really don't have to do any panning on those tracks. So I'm just going to move this mandolin 1 track to the left just a bit, and the second mandolin to the right by about the same amount. Let's hear how that sounds, just the 3 of these tracks together. So hopefully by now it sounds like all of these instruments are on the same virtual stage. And I did that by using some simple volume control, some reverb, and some left and right panning. I could do more by using EQ to simulate distance, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm not going to add reverb to any of the other tracks. I think the natural hall sound on these instruments is enough. So the last thing that I'm going to do is to add a few plugins to this master fader. The first one I'll add is this Sonatus equalizer. It comes with Cakewalk. And then right below that in the chain, I'm going to add this free plugin by Voxengo called Span. This plugin will display the energy across a frequency range. So in this case, the total sum of energies for all of the tracks will be displayed across about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And I'll be looking for this nice curve, something like this. And if I see any irregularities, or more importantly, if I hear anything, I can adjust using this equalizer. So I'll play from the B section, or the loudest part of my piece. So anytime I am orchestrating with samples, I tend to get slight buildups in the middle part of the frequency range. If you have to make extreme adjustments, chances are you probably need to fix something in your orchestration. But for minor adjustments, it's okay to deal with them at the master level. I'm going to lower about 3-4 decibels at about 1,000 hertz. That's where I was noticing a slight buildup. So the last thing I want to do is to lift a little bit of the high end, maybe around 15K, just a few decibels. I find that this is often necessary when working with samples. So finally, something you might consider is to add a plugin called Isotope 9 Elements, which is the most basic form of the Ozone 9, and I believe I got this for free a while back. So the cool thing about this plugin is it has the equalizer and stereo imager and maximizer, but it also has this thing called Master Assistant, which will listen to your track and decide for you if any adjustments need to be made. I'm going to turn on low intensity and have it listen. So that maximizer kicked in there and the volume increased. It also tells me that it wants more high range, which we already knew about, and then a slight adjustment here in the lower range. So overall, I thought I did a fairly good job at mixing, and I'm just going to add a little bit of this stereo imager to widen the sound. Keep in mind that this AI doesn't know what kind of music you're writing, really. So it's up to you ultimately to make the decisions. This is just a reference, a starting place. So I'm just going to finish up by making some minor adjustments on what the AI determined. So there you have it, a very basic mix and master, nothing too fancy. Normally this process would take hours, but you can get a decent mix fairly quickly nowadays. I'm happy with how that turned out, and hopefully through the course of this video, I've demonstrated how to effectively use these free plugins from both Cakewalk and Spitfire Audio. It's very exciting how much one can create without spending hundreds or thousands of dollars. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will definitely be making another one of these in the near future. Next time, I'll explore a very different style of cinematic music using these same instruments. So thank you so much for watching. Until next time.